Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Are you looking to buy a new home? Maybe you're thinking about selling the one you have. Well, either way, when it comes to the so-called American dream, the rules have changed. And tonight we're talking about that and why some realtors say those new changes could have a negative impact on them and their clients, especially those in the African American community. Joining me to talk about the new rules is Dr. Courtney Johnson Rose, president of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. Dr. Rose, Courtney, thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Sure thing. Let me share a couple of facts with you. According to the Urban Institute, today, black ownership, the rate is lower than it was in 2000, with just over 44% of African Americans owning their own home. The black-white home ownership gap is wider than it has been since 1968 with the Fair Housing Act.
Yes.
Now, mortgage applications for Black families are decreasing and the mortgage denial rates are increasing, and Black households lack sufficient wealth to afford increasing down payment amounts. That information, while not necessarily new, is something that a lot of Black homeowners or Black people who want to own are aware of. But what has really changed is the rules for buying and selling homes that will affect Black homeowners. Yes. Talk to me about what happened last month, August 17th, to be precise.
Thank you so much, Harold, again for having the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. So what happened was the effects of a proposed settlement. So just to back up how all of this occurred was that there was a class action lawsuit that was filed with consumers versus National Association of Realtors and several other large real estate brokerage organizations. And what the lawsuit was really about was the commission being paid for both the buyer's agent and the listing agent being paid by the seller. And is that fair? And was the seller forced to do that? So when you think about real estate transactions, there's always a buyer, there's always a seller. Typically that buyer has a representative that's helping them, and the seller has a representative that's helping them. How it used to work prior to August the 17th was that if a property was on the MLS system, which is controlled and operated by the realtor organization, if it was on that system, it had to be assumed that the seller would be paying the listing agent and the buyer's agent. And how they did that, Harold, was through something called co-oping. So those agents co-op together. You put your house on the market, you hire a listing agent. That listing agent works with the buyer's agent to get the property sold. That commission is split. It's paid by the seller, but it's split between both of those agents. What has changed is that that's not automatically assumed now. And commissions have always been negotiable, but the standard practice was that the seller paid both of those sides. Now what has changed as of August 17th is that commission for the buyer's agent is no longer listed in the MLS system. So it's no longer assumed that if the property is in that multiple listing service operated by the realtor organization, it can no longer be assumed that that buyer's agent commission is paid by the seller. So here's the problem. If it's no longer assumed and it's no longer mandatory, if you will, that commission is paid by the seller, then who pays it? Is it the buyer that pays it? And the buyer now is responsible for paying their representative. Can it be negotiated and the seller still pays it? The answer is yes and yes. But the issue is that now it's not automatic. It's not an assumption. It's going to be handled by each transaction on a case-by-case basis. It will no longer be advertised with the listing. Now, Harold, there's a lot of unintended consequences with this that actually happens. So the main goal was to make sellers not feel forced that they had to pay this commission. And the only way that you can utilize the realtor's multi-listing service was to be able to pay both sides. So that's essentially what the case was actually about. But what happens is when the real estate commission could potentially be paid for by the seller, but could also be paid for by the buyer, that can create hardships in certain communities. And what we're concerned about as the National Association of Real Estate Brokers is how does that affect the Black community? What we know as the network of Black real estate professionals is that a lot of times our buyers are coming to the table struggling to come up with their down payment assistance, struggling to come up with their closing costs. We're working with them to get that dollar amount saved so that they're ready for the closing. So now if we're barely getting to the closing, and there's several reasons why we're barely getting there. Systematic racism is number one, that we were locked out of the housing system for so long that now we are fighting an uphill battle. So if we're barely getting to the closing table with the down payment and closing costs, if you say now, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer, you're going to have to add real estate commission to have a representative on top of that, we're scared that that can knock a lot of our buyers out. Now, Harold, okay, they can still buy a house, but they don't have a real estate professional because they can't afford to pay one. That's dangerous too, because think about it. Black home ownership, you just said, is at 45%. What does that mean? That means that most of our buyers are first-time buyers. Most of them are first-generation buyers. So that means that they don't have mom and dad that they can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, what's a good interest rate? How does this whole process work? Does this sound right? They are first-generation and first-time buyers. So they need the consultation of a real estate professional to navigate them through the process. But now they have to decide whether or not they call one or have one based upon who pays them. Another thing that's big. In our communities, we are preyed upon more than any other community for predatory lending. So for predatory lending, they set up shop in our communities. They advertise more on our radio stations. They strategically come after Black consumers. Now I'm a Black consumer here on making the largest investment of my entire life. I am preyed upon by predatory lenders. They set up shop in my community. They advertise in my newspapers. I hear them on my radio. There's facts that Black consumers with 700 plus credit scores walk into major banks and come out with an FHA or subprime loan for no reason at all, just because they assume the risk is higher. So they need the expertise of a professional that does this every day to help guide them through it. So what we're most nervous about is, although real estate commission has always been negotiable, because in many cases the seller still may pay the real estate commission, but the press around this in our community is such that it may discourage Black consumers from calling and utilizing the service of Black real estate professionals or real estate professionals in general, because they're nervous about the cost, because it's already hard enough for me to come up with the basic things I have to do to buy a house. Now to add commission on to it, it's just going to sway the pendulum over where they can manage. So our biggest fear is that they will go without representation. Two, if they go without representation, they won't make it all the way through the process without proper, resources and consultation. And three, if they make it all the way through the process, what mistakes may be made during that process.
Yeah, so, because you don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know. And it's the biggest financial decision you will ever make, Harold. So if you take a 2% higher interest rate than you should because of predatory lending, that's thousands of dollars over a long-term loan that you will miss out of because you didn't know what you didn't know. You know what I mean? So it's too big of a decision to take that chance. And our community we're already starting from, behind the starting line already because of systematic racism. So we can't afford not to make the best decisions when we finally have the opportunity to buy real estate.
Let's do some real basic math so that we can be really flat-footed and plain spoken.
Yes.
Some round numbers. if I am selling my $500,000 house
Yes.
after August 17th, in other words, today,
Yes.
and the commission for the buyer's agent and the seller's agent is 3% apiece.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're talking about what, $30,000
Yeah.
that would be split. 15,000 for the buyer's agent, 15,000 for the seller's agent. But under the current rules, the buyer in the past before August 17th,
Mm-hmm.
the $30,000 would come from the sale of the house.
Correct, from the sale of the house. But I do want to note it was always negotiable.
Always negotiable, yeah. I just want to use some, because you could do 4% or what have you.
Correct.
But let's just
the industry standard, what typically kind of happened was
3 and 3.
3 and 3. Yes.
Right. But now, after August 17th, today and moving forward, if I want to buy that $500,000 house, I am now responsible, and I'm keeping it very simple, potentially responsible not for 500,000, I'm responsible for 515,000. I've got to cut, because my agent who is representing me,
yes,
in my purchase of the house, if we've negotiated or we stick with 3% for each agent, that means that I've got to dig down in my pocket and
even
reach
further,
the hole in my pocket down to my sock,
even further, yes.
and pull out $15,000
potentially. And this is
yes.
This is where the issue is. So the issue is that it is done on a case-by-case situation.
Mm-hmm.
With the MLS pre-advertising commission, what it did was you as a consumer could assume that $15,000 as the buyer is going to come out of the sale of the house from the seller. Now we just can no longer assume it. Sometimes it may, but it's a case-by-case. So now as a real estate professional, when we show a house, we now call the listing agent. I'm a buyer's agent. I call the listing agent. I say, what commission are you all paying? Is your seller paying? Is your seller not? So now when I drive up to a house with my buyer, I say, this is house ABC. It's, priced at $500,000. It's 3,500 square feet, 4-bedroom, 2-bath, built in 1988. And by the way, the seller is paying 3% commission. Or by the way, the seller is only paying 2% commission, and you'll be responsible for my other 1%. Or the seller's paying no commission, so you're responsible for it. So what it's made happen, Harold, is it's one more conversation, one more decision point, one more part of the negotiation process. But the fear is that in many cases, the seller will pay the compensation. But just the fact that we have to have this conversation will scare off some buyers. What we have seen, NARED produces a report called The State of Housing in Black America. That can be, we have 10 years worth of reports on our website, NAREB.com. But
one more time,
NAREB.com.
Okay.
You can find the State of Housing in Black America reports for the past 10 years. But what we've seen, Harold, is one of the biggest impediments to Black home ownership is, yes, down payment money, yes, lack of inventory in the market, yes, credit scores. But actually one of the number one in the top 5 is fear.
Yeah. Courtney, hold that point.
Yes.
I don't want you to forget it, but I do need to take just a quick break. And we want to remind our listeners that you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation on Sirius XM channel 141 continues in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation tonight about buying and selling a home and how the landscape for that process has changed. My
Yes.
guest is Dr. Courtney Johnson Rose, president of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. Courtney, before the break, you were talking about fear. Please continue your point.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for that, Harold. So one of the things that we have identified in our State of Housing Black America report that holds Black borrowers back is fear. Our report shows that there are more than 2 million mortgage-ready Black Americans. That means that they have the credit, they have the income to buy a house. But why haven't they done it? One of the biggest reasons is fear. Is they feel like, oh, the system's stacked against me. Oh, I'm not going to get approved. Oh, I remember, back in the day, my grandparents didn't have a house. My parents haven't had a house. I'm the first one in my family. All of those thoughts and fears sometimes hold us back from even trying. This is another example of that, Harold, is to say now the industry has changed. So I would call Courtney a real estate broker. I've heard of her before. I know she's helped a lot of people, but now, am I going to be stuck with this $15,000? So do I have to save another $15,000 to be ready to potentially pay her? The problem with that is that in a lot of cases, the commission will be paid for by the seller. It's not a guarantee, but it could be a part of negotiation. But that fear in our community is so strong that our concern is that any little thing that happens, any change in the industry, any shift, anything that makes it a little bit more complicated for our people, because there's so much fear, is a detriment potentially to Black home ownership because we're overcoming so many things. So one of the things that our organization is big on is just training and educating our community on having the conversations, understand what all the options are, find a real estate professional that will work with you in your budget to be able to make sure that you can still achieve the dream of home ownership. We stress a lot the value that home ownership brings to a family, the economic benefits to owning a home versus not owning a home over a 10-year period is tremendous. It's the best tool to build wealth. It's the best opportunity that you have as a parent to leave something for your children to have as an asset. The tax benefits are tremendous. And then you couple that with some of the more intangible benefits. Children that live in a home do better in school. They have better behavior. They do better in math and English when they're settled in a home. Homeowners are more likely to vote in the upcoming elections. It's so many benefits to owning a home. So we, as the Black real estate professionals, are focused on keeping that message out there to don't let this talk you out of pushing forward to home ownership and not building wealth for your family.
But let's talk about Black homeowners, for example, as we know, and this is particularly a case in affluent communities, such as the DMV, for African Americans. A lot of them are able to get into homes or do own homes because they are fiscally savvy.
Yes.
And they are educated. They are educated consumers. While these rule changes may be difficult for new home buyers to stomach, wouldn't this be an advantage to homeowners, Black or otherwise, who are trying to sell?
So there is always value to professional services. So I'm a Black homeowner. I've been blessed with the opportunity to buy a home. It's the biggest financial investment I made. It's where my net worth is in most cases. So I'm going to sell that home and try to potentially do something else with those funds or purchase another house or downsize. I look at that and I say, okay, I have the ability to sell this home and I want it sold. My number one goal is to sell this home for the best price in the least complicated process, correct? And I want to protect myself against any potential legal issues that may come up at closing or even beyond that, right? So I want to protect my wealth. This is a financial transaction. If I'm having a financial transaction and I'm a seller and I'm in the driver's seat because I'm selling, I'm the one who hires, I'm the one who pays, I'm driving. We have many of our Black consumers that have been blessed to be in that position. I still want professional service, Harold, because it's not what I do every day. Real estate is not rocket science. You can learn it, but every day I do something else. That's what I focus on from 9 to 5 every day, is whatever that career that I'm in. I want the real estate professional that does this every single day to navigate this process. You know why? Because I don't want to miss a step. I don't want to learn on myself. People learn on the job. I don't want to learn on the job with the biggest financial tool and investment that I have. I don't want to leave any money on the table. I don't want to miss a document that should be signed, and 5 years later, this comes back up because now the foundation to the house has an issue, which over time it will. But I want to make sure that I don't have any liability. I want to make sure that the title's clean. I want to make sure that I've paid off every lien, every HOA dues, all of those little details, because this is a big financial decision. I want an expert. I want a professional. I want somebody that's focused and getting paid, and I want to pay them to do their job and to do what they do. So what I think will happen is savvy financial African Americans will still use professional services. Most savvy professionals do, because they don't want to learn on the job. But I think what will happen is, in our industry, the folks that are not professional, those folks that have not had good tenure in the business and cannot show a track record of success, our industry will thin out from those folks. Real estate is a very highly saturated industry because it's fairly easy to get into, but it's easy to get into, Harold, but it's hard to stay in. So those that have been able to make a career out of this, those that have focused on their continuing education, those that are part of trade associations like our organization, those that do this job full time for a living, focused on their clients, will still be of service to their clients. And a savvy consumer, Black or white, Hispanic, etc., that wants to maximize their real estate investment is still going to hire a real estate professional to help them through that process. And on the other side, if I'm a seller and I'm savvy, I want to hire and compensate my listing agent, but also my buyer's agent.
But that's what I was saying. That's the point that's the point that I'm making.
I want to pay both of them because I want professional services on both sides.
Well, now and there's the rub, because if a seller has the option to pay the one representing the seller, and not the buyer, and that's what I mean, because at first blush someone would say, well, now I have the option to pay who's representing me, but but it's their responsibility for you to pay your agent. Why? And if my agent has been in the business, if my agent is, Courtney Johnson Rose, and I know that she has had her nose to the grindstone for 15, 20 years, and she knows this, why should I concern myself with paying Jane Doe agent and just pay you?
Because at the end of the day, if I'm the seller, I want both sides to have professional representation. I want another real estate professional to work with that buyer and get them over the finish line. I want a professional that's going to hold that buyer's hand and make sure that they do what they need to do in inspections and appraisal and survey. Because when we say we're going to close on September 30th, 2025, I want to close on September 30th, 2025. Somebody has to get that buyer to the closing table. So I'm willing, if I'm a savvy seller, I'm willing to compensate to get that buyer to the closing table. Because when I get to the closing table, that's when I reach all of my financial goals on the schedule that I want to reach them at. I'm buying another house. I'm refinancing my business. I'm utilizing these funds for something else. And I want to see that buyer reach that goal, because when that buyer gets to their goal, I get to my goal. The other piece that's kind of interesting about it is it becomes really, Harold, a numbers game. So say, for example, we go back to the $500,000 house, right? House on the market for $500,000. And I say, I'm not paying the buyer's agent commission. The reality of it is it's only so many dollars that the buyer has. So the buyer now has to make their offer on my house with the backdrop that I'm not paying the seller. I'm not going to pay their agent's commission. Well, is their offer still $500,000 or is their offer $485,000? The money has to come from somewhere. If it comes from the buyer, is the buyer still able to pay me $500,000 for the house? Or is the buyer now going to offer me less because the buyer has to manage how they're going to pay the real estate agent? Does the buyer move on from my listing and go to the one down the street because that listing is paying the buyer's agent? So now have I made myself less competitive to the buyer because the buyer's looking at all their expenses saying, well, now I can get into the neighborhood. I like this kitchen over here a little bit better, but I can, take that $15,000 I'm saving. I can renovate the kitchen at this other house. So let me switch from buying this one to go down the street to the one where the seller's paying buyer's agent commission. At some point, it's going to come down to a financial decision that the seller has to make and the buyer has to make. But at the end of the day, that $15,000 that we talked about earlier has to come from somewhere, and sellers are going to have to juggle that. Do I make myself less competitive by not offering it? Do I make myself more competitive by actually offering it? Where does it come from? But at the end of the day, I think the value of professional services is definitely what consumers on both sides have to think about.
I would imagine also for buyers, the landscape has changed for real estate, not just over the past 20 years, but over the past 10 years. Certainly there was a time when buyers could ask for concessions for closing costs.
Yes.
For example, are those days gone now?
So those days are rare because of inventory. So it's just an economic issue, demand and supply. And what's happened over the past few years is that the supply has not caught up with the demand. You've had more people come into America from other countries. You've had millennials, grow up and get into the housing market. All these things have changed, and demand has increased for housing, but you have not increased housing supply at the same rate. Housing supply has lagged behind the demand. So what happens is that supply-demand model creates low inventory. Low inventory means that there's more buyers than there are houses to actually buy. So that creates that competitive environment. So if I put a house on the market and I have a multitude of buyers, well, why would I do seller concessions? Why would I contribute to a buyer's closing costs? Why would I pay buyer's agent a commission when I have so much competition for my one house? I have a plethora of buyers for my one house. So this pendulum that we're in with inventory is really what's creating a scenario where there's not as much negotiation. It's even worse, Harold, in the low to moderate, median price communities, because that's where the majority of buyers are. And that's where you just don't have enough housing stock. So because of that competition, you end up seeing a lot of situations where the sellers are not negotiating because they just don't have to. Another thing that we're looking at as NARAB and as part of our state of housing report is the number of institutionalized buyers that are in the market.
Explain that, please.
So you have communities that are being bought by real estate investment trust and large real estate investment companies. So they'll come into a community that's a low to moderate income area, ideal for first time buyers to actually be in. And instead of those houses going on the market, or when those houses go on the market, they're being immediately sold to large investment companies. Now, I'm a seller. I get two offers, one from a buyer, first time buyer needing down payment assistance in 30 to 45 days to close. The other from a real estate investment trust that's going to close in 7 days, no inspection, no appraisal, and take the house as is. Cash. Which would you go with as the seller? Oh, and also no real estate commission also too. So what's happening is buyers are being, traditional buyers are being beat out in every scenario by these institutionalized investors. But what does that do? It's a bigger play. Institutionalized investors scoop up houses in that come on the market in this particular neighborhood. You look up, and 2 years later, 25% of the neighborhoods now to 28% now on average are owned by institutional investors. What does that mean? They turn those houses, they renovate them, they do new carpet, new paint, etc., renovate them, and they put them back on the market as rental homes. So instead of the opportunity to buy the home, you only have the opportunity to rent the homes. So now we're trying to increase Black home ownership here from 45% to get up to 75%, but you can't do it without any homes to purchase. Then you say, well, hey, is there an opportunity for seller concession or any type of negotiation? No, there isn't, because this supply and demand pendulum is actually off. It's not enough homes. And it's one thing to have an aging housing stock in this country, which we have. There's not enough products to renovate houses and bring them back up to par. It's another thing to have an inventory shortage, that builders are not building houses at the same rate to keep up with the demand and immigration and things of that nature in the country. And then the third thing is, now you're competing, when houses do come on the market, you're competing against institutionalized investors that are cash, no appraisal, no inspection. So you couple all of that, and back to your question, no, there is not, in many cases, a lot of room for seller concession and negotiation.
Let's talk a little bit about the housing stock there, because there are two things, and we can get into a whole conversation about gentrification and the like. But if we take a community, for example, like LaDroit Park, and in Northwest DC, just off of Florida Avenue, where historically those communities, those homes were owned by Black people.
Yes.
And then, of course, after the riots in 1968, and those Black homeowners, as they became older, their children, if they had the capacity to own homes, they wanted new, and so they moved out into the suburbs.
The suburbs, yes.
And even if you're not talking about institutional organizations or corporate organizations that are buying these homes, a lot of people, as we saw, would buy the houses because they came in not only with cash to buy, but cash to renovate. And those were the kinds of disparities,
yes,
that we've seen. Because, and that has not just happened in a place like LaDroit Park, but it has also happened in Baltimore, near Johns Hopkins Hospital, and in other communities where you have these historic homes that need not a little bit of TLC, but major renovation.
Yes.
And so that's an impediment.
It is.
One of the other impediments has to do with so-called pocket listings. Explain what that is.
So pocket listings is something that we're very concerned about, particularly in this new era post August 17th. So pocket listing is when a home is on the market for sale, but never hits the open market. What a seller does is, instead of hiring a real estate professional that puts it on the multiple listing service, it goes on the internet, it goes on Zillow and all of those other tools. Instead of a seller doing that, a seller hires a real estate professional and says, hey, I don't want my home on those tools. I don't want the mass population to be able to know that my house is for sale. I want you, as my real estate professional, to utilize your network to be able to sell my home. And within your network, I'm looking for my home to be sold without ever putting it out on the open system. Now, let's think about that. If I am in an affluent neighborhood and I hire a real estate broker and I want them to do the listing as a pocket listing, well, that real estate broker is going to market to their network. And what our fear is, a lot of times with pocket listings, our community never gets to see what's all available. We would love to live over there and put our kids in that school, but if it's a pocket listing and we're not in that network, we don't ever get to learn about that home and be able to go and see it and potentially purchase it. If it's a pocket listing, it's limited to that real estate agents and that community, if you will, to be able to keep those homes selling only amongst themselves and those that are already within the community that they want to sell to. So one of the things that we fear as NARAB during this whole August 17th changes, you're devaluing the multiple listing service and devaluing putting your property out on that system. And as you do that, you could potentially raise more pocket listings. As you raise more pocket listings, it's less access that we have as Black real estate professionals and Black consumers to see what's all on the market. We don't even know that there's a home in that neighborhood that's on the market. We never had the opportunity to go visit it and potentially put in an actual offer for it. It only went to that small network of folks that are already part of that community. It could be another form of how racism pops up within real estate again when you have pocket listings. So again, it's something that we are monitoring. Another thing that's coming out of this settlement and the changes is the commission being what's called seller's discretion, right? So because we don't have the MLS system, because it's not pre-advertised on the MLS, what the buyer's agent commission is going to be, right? That's what has changed. We took that pre-number, knowing in advance what it's going to be. Now you have to call and find out or present it with your offer. Well, we're scared that I'm seller A and I get two offers. Get one offer from Keisha Jackson. Miss Jackson sends her offer over. Well, I can go on Google and I can look up Keisha Jackson, realtor, Houston, Texas. I'm looking at pictures of Keisha because that's the way that the world works now. Then let's say Sally Meyer sends over her offer. I can do the same thing. I look up Sally Meyer, Houston realtor. I see pictures of Sally Meyer. I decide as the seller, because it's my discretion, it's not pre-negotiated or advertised anywhere. I have the discretion to say, I'm going to pay Keisha Jackson 1% if she brings a buyer. And I'm going to pay Sally Meyer 3% if she brings a buyer. And we have no control over that.
Yeah, I mean, because
it's
that
not in the system.
That would fly well under the radar.
Correct.
Because you would not know. So here's, without having this conversation be completely doom and gloom.
Yes.
Do you foresee a time in the very near future, within the next year or so, even, or 2 years, where municipalities, or even the federal government may have programs to help compensate for those changes post August 17th? And if not, what do you recommend buyers do to help give them a leg up
Yes.
post August 17th?
Yeah, so there is a lot of conversation about how to make sure that the most vulnerable groups are not pushed out of the real estate market, and their opportunity to purchase homes is not diminished. So there is a lot of talk from municipalities, government agencies, down payment assistance programs,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And if you increase down payment assistance, perhaps you have the opportunity then to have more money towards the closing costs and down payment, and it frees up some more resources to be able to compensate a buyer's agent. So that's the thought process. So yes, there is a lot of conversation about that, because there are those that are focused on increasing minority homeownership, and they know that real estate professionals are a key to that. But at the end of the day, I think the key point, Harold, is that homeownership is still the best financial tool that a family has. It's their best shot. You're going to have to pay for somewhere to live anyway. Why not pay for something that you're purchasing and experience all of the financial and tax benefits associated with it? I think that's the message to consumers, is that this is still the number one investment. If you have to pay a buyer's broker for that service, do what you have to do to get into the best investment that there is. If you're a seller and you have to pay both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, do what you have to do for the best investment that you can ever make. The benefits outweigh the process. So my advice to consumers is, number one, realize how important real estate is. Don't let this talk you out of the best wealth building tool that there is. Number two, talk to the real estate professionals. Real estate professionals have different ways that they can negotiate with you, that they can work with you, different forms of compensation. That's not always commission. There's flat fees. There's other ways to work with a real estate professional. So have the conversation. Don't just assume that you can't afford it, or don't just assume that you can't have access to it. And then the third thing is, I am hopeful and prayerful that over the next year, as this goes and processes through, it'll be some chaos, it'll be some ups and downs, some bumps in the road. But there's other states like Seattle, like Washington State, etc., that have already gone through these changes. And after about a year or so, things settled out and it kind of went back to normal. Buyers realized that they need representation. Sellers realized that they need representation. Sellers realize it's coming out of the transaction, that it's better for a buyer to have their own rep. It's better for a seller to have their own rep. And it kind of evened itself out. So I'm hopeful that after everybody settles into the changes, the reality sets in that the real estate industry works better when you have real estate professionals helping both sides of the transaction.
I think I'm going to have to let that be the last word. Dr. Courtney Johnson Rose, president of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. Thank you so much for your time and your information.
Thank you for having us.
I really appreciate it. That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, September 3rd. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.